On a quiet afternoon, Michael Adams, a man with a strong presence and a calm demeanor, walked through his neighborhood, seeking peace after a long week. Unbeknownst to him, Officer Davis, a local patrolman, watched from afar, harboring suspicions based solely on Michael's appearance. Without cause, Davis stopped Michael, interrogating him, and eventually placing him under arrest. What the officer didn't realize was that he had just detained a high-ranking UC Army general, a man who had served his country with honor, now humiliated by prejudice. This story shines a harsh light on the assumptions that divide us and the courage it takes to confront them. But even through the injustice, a glimmer of hope emerges as this moment sparks a necessary conversation about fairness, respect, and the change needed in our communities. If you are not subscribed, I recommend you subscribe and activate the bell to avoid missing any videos. Before we dive into this story, please let me know in the comments where you're watching from. The golden hues of the late afternoon sun cast a serene glow over the wealthy neighborhood, its tree-lined streets bathed in the kind of tranquility that spoke of privilege and peace. It was the sort of place where silence reigned supreme, broken only by the distant hum of a gardener's trimmer or the laughter of children playing behind tall, well-manicured hedges. Here, life moved at a slower, more deliberate pace, the worries of the world seemingly a distant echo. For most people, this was a sanctuary and escape from the chaos of life's pressures. For Michael Adams, it was much more. Michael, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a bearing that reflected his years of military service, moved with a quiet confidence that belied his otherwise casual appearance. His athletic build, honed by decades of discipline and training, was wrapped in the simplicity of a white t-shirt and jeans. But it wasn't just his physique that commanded attention. It was something intangible, an aura of authority, of leadership, that followed him wherever he went. His very posture spoke of a man who had weathered storms, faced countless challenges, and emerged stronger for it. Today, like so many other days, he found solace in a simple walk. The pavement felt cool beneath his feet as he strolled down the familiar streets, his footsteps light and rhythmic. This neighborhood, with its sprawling homes and towering oak trees, was a place of respite for him. He owned a house just a few blocks away, a quiet retreat he had purchased years ago to escape the relentless demands of his career as a high-ranking general in the United States Army. It was here, in the heart of this peaceful community, that he came to think, to reflect, to breathe. As Michael walked, the late afternoon sun dipped lower, casting long, lazy shadows across the ground. He was alone with his thoughts, allowing the simple beauty of the day to wash over him. The warmth of the sun, the gentle breeze, the sound of birds chirping in the distance, it was all a reminder of life's fleeting moments of peace. For now, he was just another person enjoying the quiet, ordinary pleasure of a summer afternoon, unaware that this very moment, so serene and unassuming, was on the verge of being shattered. Not far behind him, in the cold, mechanical confines of a patrol car, Officer James Davis adjusted his rearview mirror with a practiced hand. The car rolled along slowly, its engine purring like a predator stalking its next meal. Davis's eyes, sharp and vigilant, scanned the neighborhood with an intensity that spoke of suspicion, of readiness for confrontation. He had driven these streets countless times before, his presence a constant in this community. For Davis, this was his territory, a pristine, affluent neighborhood that needed protecting, and he saw himself as the thin line between order and chaos. If you're still tuned into this video and find the story inspiring, drop a 1 in the comments to let me know you're still with me. As his patrol car crawled along, Davis's mind drifted, his thoughts tapping into the prejudices that had long festered beneath the surface of his outward professionalism. His fingers drummed absently on the steering wheel, a silent rhythm that mirrored his impatience. Everything seemed normal, too normal perhaps. The familiar sights of children's bicycles leaning against fences, gardeners meticulously trimming hedges, and joggers pacing through the streets passed him by without much notice. Nothing felt out of place. But then, something caught his eye. A black man walking down the street. The sight of him, so calm and casual, immediately set off alarms in Davis's mind. His eyes narrowed as he took in the figure, tall and muscular, moving with a relaxed ease that only heightened Davis's growing suspicion. The man was dressed simply just a plain white t-shirt and jeans, but to Davis, there was something about him that didn't belong. His skin, his presence, it was enough to ignite a deep-seated prejudice that Davis had carried with him for years. "Who the hell is that?" Davis muttered to himself, his voice low and filled with a venom that he barely even recognized anymore. His grip on the steering wheel tightened, as he slowed the car to a near stop, his eyes never leaving the man who continued to walk, blissfully unaware of the gaze burning into his back. There was nothing overtly suspicious about the man. His stride was relaxed, his expression calm, as though he were simply enjoying the beauty of the day. But to Davis, it didn't matter. He didn't recognize the man, and in this neighborhood, that alone was enough to raise red flags. How could someone like him belong here, in this pristine, wealthy enclave? Davis's mind, clouded by bigotry, raced with unjustified assumptions. The man didn't fit the mold of who he thought should be walking these streets. As Davis pulled the car to the curb, his heart began to race, his pulse quickening with a toxic blend of fear and aggression. In his mind, he was doing his job protecting the community from a threat, even if that threat existed only in his warped perception. He stepped out of the car, his hand instinctively resting on the holster of his gun, as though the very sight of the black man necessitated such a response. The decision had already been made in his mind. This man didn't belong. He was up to no good. Davis's voice cut through the quiet afternoon like a knife as he approached, demanding to know what Michael was doing there. His words were laced with a barely concealed hostility, a sharpness that betrayed the prejudice fueling his every action. Michael, taken aback by the sudden confrontation, responded with calm dignity, as he had been trained to do in the face of aggression. He explained patiently that he lived just a few blocks away, that he was a homeowner, and that this was his neighborhood too. But Davis wasn't listening. His mind was already made up. He saw only what he wanted to see, and nothing Michael could say would change that. The officer's suspicions, irrational and baseless, led him to escalate the situation. He demanded identification and questioned Michael's presence, and when the general, frustrated but still composed, asked why he was being treated this way, Davis's prejudice boiled over. In a moment of blind injustice, Davis placed Michael under arrest. The handcuffs clicked into place, cold and heavy on Michael's wrists, a symbol of the systemic racism that had plagued men like him for generations. The general, a man who had spent his life serving his country, now found himself humiliated and disrespected by the very system he had sworn to protect. He was not seen as a leader, a protector, or a citizen. To Davis, he was simply a black man who didn't belong. It wasn't until later, after Michael had been taken into custody and Davis had returned to his patrol, that the truth came crashing down. A superior officer, having heard of the arrest, informed Davis of the staggering mistake he had made. The man he had so callously arrested, the man he had treated with such disdain, was none other than General Michael Adams, a decorated officer, a man of honor and dignity, whose service to the country far surpassed the small-minded hatred that had led to his arrest. The realization hit Davis like a blow to the gut, but it was too late. The damage had been done. He had allowed his ignorance, his racism, to dictate his actions, and in doing so, he had not only violated the rights of an innocent man, but he had also betrayed the very values he claimed to uphold. And as the weight of his actions settled on his shoulders, the officer was left with the bitter truth that he had been the true danger that day, not Michael Adams. Michael, still reeling from the injustice he had faced, would eventually walk free. But the scars of that moment, of being reduced to nothing more than a stereotype in the eyes of someone sworn to protect, would linger. It was a stark reminder of the harsh realities that even the most decorated and honorable among us are not immune to the poison of racism, and that the fight for justice, for equality, was far from over. Davis had been on the force for 10 long years, long enough to know when something felt off. His instincts, honed over a decade of patrols and arrests, were tingling with unease. This was an affluent, predominantly white neighborhood, the kind of place where anything out of the ordinary stood out like a sore thumb. And in his experience, when someone didn't fit the mold, trouble wasn't far behind. Maybe the guy was lost, or maybe he was casing the neighborhood, scoping out houses. Either way, Davis wasn't about to just let it slide. His gut told him he needed to know more. He eased off the gas, slowing his patrol car to a crawl as he kept pace with the man walking along the sidewalk. From the corner of his eye, Davis saw the man glance briefly at the car, his expression calm, indifferent even. The officer's jaw clenched. That calmness bothered him. It was as if the man wasn't concerned about his presence at all, like he belonged there without a second thought, and Davis didn't like that one bit. His decision was quick, almost automatic. With a flick of his wrist, he turned the wheel and pulled his patrol car up to the curb, parking just ahead of the man. The low hum of the engine died as he stepped out of the car, adjusting his belt and the radio clip to his shoulder. The man kept walking, seemingly oblivious to the officer's approach, and that flicker of annoyance Davis had felt earlier grew into something sharper. He raised his voice as he took purposeful strides toward the man. "Hey, you there," Davis called out, his voice cutting through the otherwise quiet street. The man stopped, turning slowly to face the officer. His eyes met Davis's, steady and unflinching, as if completely unfazed by the sudden confrontation. "Yes, officer. Is there a problem?" The man's voice was calm and level without a hint of tension. Davis didn't answer right away. He took a moment to size the man up now that he was closer. His face remained composed, his body language relaxed, too relaxed for Davis's liking. Something was unsettling about how unfazed this man seemed, as if he didn't view the officer as a threat. That calmness only deepened Davis's suspicions. "What are you doing here?" Davis demanded, his tone sharper now, pushing for an explanation. "Just taking a walk," the man replied evenly, his tone matching his demeanor. "Is that not allowed?" Davis frowned, irritation building in his chest. The man's response, so calm and unbothered, rubbed him the wrong way. It made Davis feel as if he wasn't in control of the situation, and that was something he couldn't tolerate. He squared his shoulders, taking another step closer. "I'm going to need to see some ID," Davis said, his voice hardening with authority. The man raised an eyebrow but didn't flinch or back away. "Why? Am I being accused of something?" That simple question stoked the embers of Davis's annoyance into full-blown frustration. "This is a private neighborhood," Davis snapped. "We don't usually see people like you around here. I have the right to question anyone who seems out of place." The man sighed softly, but not in fear or submission. It was a quiet, almost weary sound, as though he had been through this before and had no energy for it. Davis's irritation flared. "I live nearby," the man said, his voice calm as ever, "just a few blocks over." "I'm not doing anything wrong, officer. I'm simply enjoying the walk." "Show me some ID," Davis repeated, more forcefully this time, his hand inching toward his belt where his radio and other tools of enforcement hung. He was in no mood for resistance, and in situations like this, control was everything. His training had drilled that into him: assert your authority, take control, and don't let the situation slip from your grasp. With deliberate slowness, the man reached into his pocket and pulled out his wallet. He opened it and held up his identification for Davis to see. Davis snatched it from his hand, glancing at the name and address on the ID. For a split second, surprise flickered across his face. The address was indeed local, just a few blocks away, as the man had said. But something still didn't sit right with Davis. Maybe it was the man's unflappable calmness, or maybe it was just the lingering feeling in his gut that something was off. "I've never seen you around here before," Davis said, his voice still laced with suspicion. "How long have you lived here?" If you're still tuned into this video and find the story inspiring, drop a 2 in the comments to let me know you're still with me. "Several years," the man answered, his tone still maddeningly calm. "I'm not out much. I'm usually working." "I don't see why this is necessary." The heat rose in Davis's face, a flush of anger spreading across his skin. He didn't like being questioned, especially not by someone who seemed to think they were above suspicion. His grip tightened on the man's ID, his knuckles white. "Necessary or not, I have a job to do," Davis snapped, his patience fraying. "We've had reports of suspicious activity in the area, and I need to make sure everything is in order." The man didn't respond, his steady gaze still locked on Davis. There was no fear in his eyes, no nervousness, no sign that he was about to back down. Davis hated that. He was the one in control here, not this stranger who thought he could walk around as if he belonged, as if he could challenge Davis's authority without consequences. "Stay right here," Davis barked, his voice filled with the authority he felt was slipping away. "Don't move." The man remained still, his posture unchanged, his calm composure unwavering. But in Davis's mind, it was a challenge, a silent resistance that gnawed at his sense of control. He turned, ID still in hand, and walked back to his patrol car, his mind racing. He needed to assert his dominance over the situation to regain control, but something about this man, his calmness, his refusal to show fear, was making Davis feel more unsettled by the second. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the street as Davis's frustration simmered. The quiet affluence of the neighborhood seemed to close in around him, and he knew, deep down, that this encounter was spiraling into something it didn't need to be. But he couldn't stop himself. He had to show that he was in charge no matter the cost. In his mind, control was everything. And this man, this black man, walking so confidently through this wealthy, predominantly white neighborhood was disrupting that control. Davis wasn't about to let that stand. Davis felt the tension in the room shift as Michael's question hung in the air, thick with implication. For a split second, Davis hesitated, his jaw clenched tight. His heart was still pounding from the adrenaline of the encounter, but now something else pulsed underneath his defensiveness: doubt, uncertainty, and perhaps the first flicker of shame. The room seemed to shrink around them as Michael's calm, pointed words chipped away at the authority Davis had been trying so hard to assert. "People like you," Davis began, but his voice faltered. He felt the weight of those words, words that carried with them decades, no centuries of history. History he had no right to use as a weapon, but had unconsciously wielded in his rush to control the situation. His mind raced to justify what had just transpired. He was a police officer, sworn to protect this neighborhood, wasn't he? But the look in Michael's eyes, steady, unwavering, was like a mirror reflecting the deeper truth he was trying so hard to suppress. Michael's gaze didn't falter. He had seen this before, this moment where a person, whether they wore a badge or not, exposed the raw ugliness of their prejudice, whether they admitted it or not. He had endured this kind of scrutiny, this kind of profiling for as long as he could remember. And yet, even now, sitting handcuffed in a police station, having been treated like a common criminal, he remained composed. Because Michael knew, in a way that Davis never could, that keeping his calm, his dignity, was his greatest act of defiance. "You need to understand something," Officer Michael said, his voice firm but not raised. "I've served this country for over 25 years. I've led men into battle, commanded respect, and protected the very freedoms that allow people like you to wear that uniform. I bought my home in that neighborhood because I earned it through years of sacrifice, hard work, and dedication. And the fact that you saw me as a threat, the fact that you believe I don't belong there, says more about you than it does about me." Davis's throat tightened. He wanted to push back, to say something, but Michael's words hit too close to the truth. This was a man who had done more in his life than Davis could ever imagine. A man who had likely faced dangers far greater than anything Davis had encountered in his comfortable suburban patrols. And yet here Davis was, standing over him, treating him as though he were less than, as though his very presence on those quiet, tree-lined streets was somehow a violation of the natural order. "You don't understand," Davis muttered, though the conviction in his voice had waned. "It's my job to make sure the neighborhood stays safe. It's not personal." "Not personal," Michael repeated, raising his eyebrows slightly. "This is as personal as it gets. You saw a black man walking in a wealthy neighborhood, and you assumed the worst. You didn't ask questions, you didn't give me the benefit of the doubt, you just reacted. You cuffed me, paraded me through this station, and treated me like a criminal based on nothing but your assumptions. That's personal." The room was quiet now, save for the faint hum of the air conditioning. Davis shifted uncomfortably, arms still crossed tightly over his chest. He wanted to deny it, to reject what Michael was saying, but deep down he knew it was true. He had let his bias, his ingrained prejudice, dictate his actions. He had judged Michael not for who he was, but for what he looked like. And now, standing here in this small holding room, that realization was gnawing at him. "Look," Davis said, his voice softer, almost uncertain now. "Maybe I was wrong, but you have to understand. We've had break-ins in that neighborhood, reports of suspicious activity. I can't just ignore it when something seems out of place." Michael leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. "And that's the problem, officer. You saw me as out of place because I don't fit into your idea of what belongs in that neighborhood. But let me tell you this, I belong wherever I am, just like anyone else. I've earned that right. What you did today wasn't about keeping the neighborhood safe. It was about keeping it comfortable for people like you." Davis flinched at that last line, the weight of it settling in his gut. He hadn't realized it, but that's exactly what he had done, preserved the comfort of the neighborhood by removing what didn't fit. He had convinced himself it was his duty, his responsibility to uphold the safety of the community. But in doing so, he had denied someone their dignity, their basic right to exist without fear or suspicion. The room remained tense, the air thick with words unsaid. Davis uncrossed his arms, his face softening slightly, though his pride kept him from fully acknowledging his mistake. "I'm just trying to do my job," he repeated, almost to himself. Michael shook his head, his eyes filled with a sadness that went beyond this one interaction. "Doing your job doesn't mean stripping people of their humanity. It doesn't mean assuming guilt because of the color of someone's skin. You can do better than that, officer. We all can." For the first time, Davis didn't respond. He stood there, staring at Michael, feeling the weight of his own actions pressing down on him. He didn't know what to say, because there was nothing that could erase what he had done. The tension in the room had shifted from one of confrontation to one of quiet reckoning. Eventually, another officer came to relieve Davis, leading Michael out of the holding room and down the hallway. As the door closed behind them, Davis remained where he stood, his mind swirling with thoughts he couldn't quite grasp. He had entered this situation certain of himself, of his instincts, of his role as protector. But now, standing in the stark light of his actions, all he was left with was doubt and regret. Davis looked at the empty chair where Michael had sat, the handcuffs that had held a man who had served his country with honor. And in that silence, for the first time in his career, he questioned what kind of protector he really was. Sergeant Smith leaned forward slightly, her fingers tapping lightly on the edge of her desk as she considered the weight of the moment. The authority in her posture was clear, but so was the empathy in her eyes as she glanced at Michael. She knew the stakes, not just for the department, but for the broader implications of what had transpired. "I want to make this right, General Adams," she began, her voice steady but carrying an undercurrent of remorse. "What happened today wasn't just a lapse in judgment. It's part of a deeper problem that's been festering for too long. What you experienced should never happen to anyone, whether they're a decorated general or just someone trying to live their life." Michael nodded, appreciating her candor. He had been in rooms like this before, places where promises of change were made but rarely fulfilled. This time he needed it to be different. He could still feel the cold pressure of the handcuffs on his wrists, a painful reminder of how easily one's dignity could be stripped away. "Sergeant," he said slowly, choosing his words with care, "I appreciate your concern, but the issue runs deeper than what happened to me today. It's systemic. It's in the assumptions officers like Davis make, the biases they carry with them into every interaction. If we don't address that, if we don't root it out, then incidents like this will keep happening." Smith's expression softened, her eyes narrowing as she listened intently. "I agree. I've seen it myself in subtle ways and sometimes more overtly, like today. Our training is supposed to combat this, but clearly we have a long way to go." Michael leaned forward slightly, the weight of his words pressing into the small room. "This isn't just about training, Sergeant. It's about accountability. It's about fostering a culture where officers are not only taught to recognize their biases but are held accountable when those biases lead to injustice. It can't just be a slap on the wrist or a workshop. Real change requires a shift in mindset, one that's reinforced every day on the job." Smith nodded again, this time more firmly. "You're right. I'll ensure that this incident sparks that conversation within our ranks. But more than that, I want to involve you in this process. Your perspective is invaluable. If you're willing, I'd like you to be part of the dialogue we start within the department." Michael was silent for a moment, considering her offer. He had fought many battles in his lifetime, physical ones, emotional ones, ones against an enemy he could see and strategize against. This was different, more insidious, because it required changing hearts and minds. But he also knew it was a fight worth engaging in. "I'll do it," he finally said, his voice firm, "not just because of what happened to me, but because I know there are others who won't have the platform I do to make their voices heard. If I can help shift the culture here, even a little, then it's worth it." Smith extended her hand across the desk. "Thank you, General. Your leadership is exactly what we need right now. We'll make this right." As Michael shook her hand, a sense of purpose settled over him. He knew this wouldn't be easy, change never was. But in that moment, he felt the first stirrings of hope, knowing that something important had started today. Not just for him, but for countless others who walked through neighborhoods, stores, and streets under the weight of assumptions they never asked for. Outside the office, Officer Davis stood near the hallway, still wrestling with the aftermath of his actions. His face was a mask of confusion, perhaps tinged with regret, though he said nothing as Michael exited the room. Michael paused for a brief moment, catching Davis's eye. "This isn't about making you the villain, Davis," he said quietly but with conviction. "It's about making sure this doesn't happen again, to me or anyone else." Davis opened his mouth as if to respond, but no words came. Instead, he gave a brief, almost imperceptible nod, a gesture that seemed to convey an unspoken acknowledgement of his error. Whether that acknowledgement would lead to meaningful change, Michael didn't know. But for now, it was a small step in the right direction. As Michael walked out of the station and into the fading light of the evening, He felt the weight of the day still pressing on his shoulders. The battle for justice, for equality was ongoing. But in that moment, he was reminded that the fight wasn't just his, it belonged to everyone who believed in a world where people were judged by the content of their character, not the color of their skin. And he was ready to keep fighting, one step at a time. Back in the station, Sergeant Smith watched from her office, knowing that the conversation they'd had was only the beginning of a much longer journey. But as she saw Michael leave, his head held high despite everything that had happened, she knew one thing for certain: change was coming, and it couldn't come soon enough. Sergeant Smith shifted in her chair, her brow furrowed as she absorbed the weight of Michael's words. "General Adams, you're right. It's not just about this one incident or a single apology. It's about changing the way we think, the way we approach situations. We can't afford to let biases, conscious or unconscious, shape the way we do our job, and I take full responsibility for making sure this kind of behavior doesn't go unchecked." Michael's gaze was unwavering, but his tone was steady. "This isn't about me personally, Sergeant. This is about every black man or woman who's ever been treated like they don't belong, like they're a threat for simply existing. I've dealt with prejudice my whole life. But when it comes from the people who are supposed to protect us, it cuts deeper. We need to address the mindset that leads to moments like this." Smith nodded, her lips pressed into a thin line. "I understand. And I won't let this get swept under the rug. Davis will face disciplinary action, and we'll be taking a closer look at how we're training our officers to ensure situations like this don't happen again." She turned to Officer Davis, who stood silently by, his face pale and his posture tense. The weight of the moment had clearly sunk in, but Michael could see that his apology was more about the consequences he feared than any real understanding of his actions. Still, Michael knew that this moment could be a chance for Davis to reflect and grow if he was willing to listen. Michael stood up, his imposing frame towering over Davis as he faced him directly. "You thought you were protecting the neighborhood," Michael said, his voice calm but firm, "but you weren't. You were protecting a version of safety that exists only in your head. A version that assumes people who look like me don't belong. That's not real safety. Real safety is about ensuring everyone is treated with respect and fairness." Davis swallowed hard, his eyes flickering between Michael and the floor. His voice was quiet, almost strained. "I didn't mean for it to go this way. I was just following my instincts." Michael shook his head slightly. "Your instincts are shaped by the world around you, by what you've been taught to see as dangerous. You need to question those instincts, because if you don't, you'll keep making the same mistakes, and people like me will keep paying the price." If you're still tuned into this video and find the story inspiring, drop a 3 in the comments to let me know you're still with me. Davis's shoulders sagged as the weight of Michael's words settled in. For the first time, he seemed to grasp the gravity of the situation. "I'm sorry," he mumbled again, though this time there was a hint of something more genuine behind it. Michael regarded him for a moment, then nodded. "An apology is a start, but it's not enough. You have to change how you approach your job, how you see people. This can't be just a one-time thing. It's got to be a shift in how you operate every day." Sergeant Smith stepped forward, sensing the need to close the conversation on a productive note. "General Adams is right, Davis. This is a learning moment for you, for all of us. We're going to make sure that our officers are better equipped to handle situations like this in the future with respect and without prejudice." She turned to Michael, her expression firm but respectful. "Thank you for your patience, General. I know this doesn't make up for what you went through, but I promise you we'll do everything we can to make sure it doesn't happen again." Michael nodded once, feeling the weight of the conversation lifting slightly, though the larger burden of change still loomed. "I hope so, Sergeant. I really hope so." With that, Michael turned to leave, walking out of the station with his head held high. He had faced countless battles in his life, but this fight for equality, for respect, was one he knew wouldn't be won in a day. It was a battle that needed to be fought in every neighborhood, every community, until moments like these were a thing of the past. And as he stepped out into the fading light of the evening, he knew that while the journey ahead was long, today had been a small step in the right direction. As the officers filed out of the briefing room, the air was thick with contemplation, tension, and a sense of discomfort that rippled through the station. Sergeant Smith remained at the front, watching the varied reactions on her officers' faces, some contemplative, others hardened with resistance. She knew that change would not come easily, but she had made a commitment, and there was no turning back. The suspension of Officer Davis was just the beginning of a long road toward accountability and transformation. Officer Ramirez lingered for a moment before walking out, his brow furrowed. "Sergeant," he said, stopping at the doorway, "I think what you're doing is right. Davis messed up, and we need to fix how we handle situations like this. But some of the guys, they're not going to take it well." Smith nodded, appreciating his honesty. "I know," she said quietly, "but this isn't about popularity. It's about doing what's right. If we don't change the culture now, it'll only get worse." Ramirez nodded thoughtfully and walked out, leaving Smith alone in the now empty briefing room. She took a deep breath, feeling the weight of responsibility settle deeper on her shoulders. She had made a stand, but now came the hard part, seeing it through. Meanwhile, the news of Officer Davis's suspension and the incident involving General Michael Adams had spread beyond the station, reaching the ears of the wider community. By the afternoon, it was the topic of conversation across the neighborhood. Some were shocked, others unsurprised, but everyone had an opinion. At the police station, conversations grew in intensity. Some officers privately defended Davis, arguing that he was just doing his job and that he had followed protocol. Others agreed with Sergeant Smith's stance, recognizing that the incident revealed deep-seated biases that needed to be addressed. The station felt like it was sitting on a powder keg, with opinions clashing behind closed doors and in hushed conversations. That afternoon, Smith sat at her desk, reflecting on the events of the day. She had already begun drafting a formal plan to roll out additional training sessions, working with experts in racial sensitivity and de-escalation. It was a step she knew wouldn't fix everything, but it was necessary. As she worked, a knock on her office door pulled her attention. Chief Reynolds, the head of the department, stepped in, his tall frame filling the doorway. He had a stern but thoughtful look on his face. "Laura," he said, his voice low, "I've heard about the Davis situation. You handled it well, but I wanted to check in with you. This is going to create waves. You know that, right?" Smith looked up, her expression steady but determined. "Yes, Chief, I do. But it's the right thing to do. If we don't address this now, we're just perpetuating the problem." The chief nodded, stepping further into the room. "I agree with you. But understand this, it's going to take a lot of work to shift the culture in this department. Some of the officers are already pushing back. You have to be ready for resistance." Smith sighed, but remained resolute. "I am. We can't keep ignoring these problems. If we're going to uphold our duty to protect and serve, we need to root out the biases that are eroding trust. We have to be better." The chief gave her a thoughtful look, then nodded. "I support you. Let's make sure we handle this right." As the chief left, Smith sat back in her chair, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. She knew this journey would be long and fraught with challenges, but she wasn't alone in it. There were others, like General Michael Adams, like Officer Ramirez, like Chief Reynolds, who were committed to making things better. Later that evening, as Michael sat in his home, reflecting on the events of the previous day, his phone buzzed with messages from friends and colleagues. Word of what had happened to him had spread quickly, and many people reached out to express their outrage and support. Michael appreciated the concern, but more than that, he appreciated the opportunity that had come from the incident. He had spent his life fighting for his country, leading troops in combat and making critical decisions under pressure. But this battle, this fight for justice and equality on home soil, felt different. It felt personal in a way the others hadn't. And now, Michael knew he had a role to play in shaping the future, not just for himself, but for others who had faced the same injustice. As he sat in the quiet of his living room, a sense of resolve filled him. The road ahead would be long, but for the first time it felt like people were listening. As General Michael Adams left the community center that evening, he felt the weight of the day's discussion still hanging in the air. It was a hopeful beginning, but he knew that real change would take far more than just one meeting. The issues ran deep, and while there was a sense of commitment in the room, the hard work had only just begun. Over the next few days, Michael returned to his regular routine, but his mind kept circling back to the discussions from the meeting. The themes of trust, accountability, and transparency stuck with him. He reflected on his years of service, where every decision he made in the heat of battle or during moments of crisis had consequences. The police department, he realized, needed to approach their responsibilities in the same way, with clarity of purpose, respect for the community they served, and the understanding that every action they took could ripple outwards in ways they couldn't always predict. The phone call from Sergeant Smith, updating him on the investigation and the next steps, had been a welcome sign of progress. She had assured him that Officer Davis's suspension was being handled with the seriousness it deserved, and that the internal review was ongoing. But Michael also knew that Smith's intentions, though genuine, were just a small piece of the puzzle. The change he wanted to see required a shift in the mindset of every officer who walked the streets, patrolled the neighborhoods, and interacted with people like him. As the days passed, the community buzzed with conversation. The meeting had sparked a new kind of dialogue, one that hadn't existed before. Residents were talking more openly about their experiences with law enforcement, sharing stories of both positive and negative encounters. Local activists, emboldened by the progress being made, began organizing more events, discussions, and forums to keep the momentum going. The atmosphere was tense but charged with the possibility of something different. One evening, as Michael sat on his porch, sipping a cup of tea, he received an unexpected call from Mrs. Turner, the community leader who had spoken so passionately at the meeting. Her voice was warm and thoughtful as she thanked him for his role in starting this much-needed conversation. "General Adams," she said, "what you did at that meeting, it mattered. People are talking, people are listening, and most importantly, people are starting to believe that things can change. But we've got a long way to go, and I think you're the right person to help lead that change." Michael smiled, though the weight of her words settled on him. "Thank you, Mrs. Turner. I'm just one voice, but I'll do everything I can to keep this going. We owe it to everyone in this community to make sure they feel safe, respected, and heard." As he hung up the phone, Michael felt a renewed sense of purpose. The road ahead would be long and challenging, filled with moments of resistance, doubt, and frustration. But as he had learned in his years of service, progress often came in small, steady steps, and this was a battle worth fighting. The next day, Michael found himself back at the community center for another meeting. This time, the room was even more packed than before, with more faces from both the police department and the community. The atmosphere was one of determination, a shared understanding that this was the beginning of something important. As he stepped into the room, Michael noticed Sergeant Smith and Officer Ramirez standing together, deep in conversation. They spotted him and waved him over, both offering appreciative nods. The community was showing up, the police were engaging, and for the first time in a long while, there was a sense of real possibility in the air. Smith walked over to him. "I wanted to thank you again, General Adams. The officers have responded to the new training sessions, and we're already seeing some positive changes. But we know there's still a lot of work to be done." Michael nodded. "It's a start, Sergeant, a good one. But remember, change isn't just about training. It's about the day-to-day decisions each officer makes when they put on that uniform. It's about seeing the people they serve as human beings, not just as potential threats." Smith smiled, her determination clear. "You're right. And we're going to make sure that message sticks." The meeting started, and as people shared their thoughts and concerns, Michael listened carefully. Each voice was important, and every idea, no matter how small, contributed to the growing sense of collaboration. The police department was committing to regular community meetings, increased transparency, and a promise to revisit policies that had long been criticized for their disproportionate impact on minority communities. As the conversations continued, Michael felt something stirring in the room, a sense of unity that hadn't been there before. It wasn't perfect, and there was still plenty of skepticism, but for the first time it felt like the walls between the community and the police were starting to come down. When the meeting finally ended, Mrs. Turner stood up to address the group one last time. "We're just getting started," she said, her voice steady and filled with conviction. "But we're moving in the right direction. And with people like General Adams and Sergeant Smith working with us, I believe we can make this community stronger, safer, and more just for everyone." As the group dispersed, Michael took one last look around the room, filled with people who, despite their differences, were now working toward a common goal. He knew the fight wasn't over, and that there would be setbacks along the way. But for the first time in a long while, he felt hopeful. He wasn't walking this path alone anymore. As he stepped back out into the evening light, the sense of resolve he had felt weeks earlier had solidified into something stronger. The road to justice and equality was long, but Michael knew that with the right people beside him, it was a road worth walking. Together, they would make sure that no one else in their community had to experience what he did, and that was a victory worth fighting for. The room was silent for a moment as Michael's words sank in, the weight of his message resonating with everyone present. He could see the faces of the community members shift from uncertainty to a growing determination. This wasn't just a conversation, it was a call to action. Michael continued, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. "It's easy to feel like we don't have control over what happens around us, but the truth is we have more power than we think," Michael said, his voice strong. "It's not just about what happens when police officers show up. It's about how we as neighbors treat one another, how we look out for each other, how we break down barriers that separate us based on things like race, background, or assumptions. Together, we can create a space where everyone belongs." Sergeant Smith, standing at the back of the room with Officer Ramirez and a few others, felt a sense of pride in how far this conversation had come. The journey was just beginning, but the fact that it was happening at all, and with so much openness and sincerity, was already a victory. She glanced at Ramirez, who was clearly listening intently, the gears in his mind still turning after the training sessions and Michael's powerful words. As Michael wrapped up his speech, the energy in the room shifted. Hands went up, more questions followed, and what had begun as a forum quickly turned into a full-blown dialogue between the community and the officers. Michael fielded questions about accountability, while Sergeant Smith spoke about the department's plans for transparency and reform. Residents shared their own experiences, some of them painful and others hopeful, offering suggestions on how they could all move forward together. If you're still tuned into this video and find the story inspiring, drop a 4 in the comments to let me know you're still with me. One young man stood up and spoke, his voice quivering with emotion. "I grew up here," he said. "I love this neighborhood, but sometimes I feel like I don't belong. Like people are always watching me, waiting for me to make a mistake." General Adams, what happened to you? It's happened to me too, just in different ways. But tonight, hearing you speak, I feel like we can change that. Michael looked at him with compassion. "You do belong," he said simply. "And it's on all of us to make sure everyone in this community feels the same way. You shouldn't have to prove yourself to anyone, but together, we can create a place where no one feels like an outsider." The young man nodded, his shoulders relaxing as if a burden had been lifted. As the evening progressed, the conversation turned toward solutions. What concrete steps could be taken to bridge the gap between the police and the community? Sergeant Smith outlined the new policies being implemented, from more community patrols to ongoing training that emphasized empathy and understanding. Officer Ramirez offered to help facilitate regular meet and greets between officers and residents, a gesture that was met with enthusiastic nods from the crowd. The atmosphere in the room had shifted from one of tension to one of collaboration. People were talking, engaging, and sharing ideas with a newfound sense of hope. By the end of the night, the feeling that something positive had been set in motion was palpable. As the meeting came to a close, Michael stayed behind for a few moments, speaking with neighbors who approached him to offer their support and thanks. Sergeant Smith and Officer Ramirez made their way over to him, both looking a little exhausted but proud of how the evening had gone. "That was powerful," General Smith said, extending her hand. "Thank you for your leadership tonight." Michael shook her hand. "Thank you, Sergeant. Tonight wasn't just about me, though. It was about all of us. And I'm grateful to see the department stepping up." Ramirez chimed in, his usual casual demeanor replaced with a more reflective tone. "These kinds of conversations, they're hard, but they're necessary. I've been thinking about what you said, General, about assumptions about the way we approach people. I've been guilty of it too, and I'm realizing that we've all got work to do." Michael gave him a nod of respect. "The fact that you're willing to admit that is the first step, Officer Ramirez. We've all got things to learn." Smith, Ramirez, and Michael stood there for a moment, watching as the last few residents left the community center. The work ahead was daunting, but the seeds of change had been planted, and there was no turning back now. As they parted ways, Michael walked out into the cool night air, feeling lighter than he had in weeks. The conversations had been tough, but necessary. And now, he knew that they had a chance to make real progress. The road ahead was still long, but for the first time, Michael felt confident that the community and the police were moving forward together, united in their commitment to justice, equality, and mutual respect. For Michael, this was not just about what had happened to him. It was about creating a future where incidents like his wouldn't happen to anyone else. And for the first time, it felt like that future was within reach. Officer Ramirez gave a firm nod, then slowly drove off, leaving Michael with a sense of calm he hadn't felt in a while. The encounter felt different, respectful, genuine, and free of the tension that had once marred his walks through the neighborhood. It was a small moment, but it symbolized something much larger, the progress that was taking root within the community and the police department. As Michael continued his walk, he reflected on how much had changed in the past few weeks. The department had taken visible steps toward accountability, with more officers like Ramirez embracing a new approach to community engagement. Training sessions on racial bias and de-escalation tactics were no longer seen as just another mandatory activity, but as an opportunity to foster real connections and challenge old ways of thinking. Sergeant Smith had kept her word. She was pushing for him, and it was making an impact. That afternoon, Michael received a call from Mrs. Turner, the community leader who had helped organize the previous forum. She invited him to another gathering, this time focused on action plans, discussing how both the community and law enforcement could sustain the positive momentum that had been built. Michael accepted without hesitation. He knew that these conversations needed to continue, and he was ready to keep playing his part. The next evening, the community center buzzed with energy. This forum, like the last, was packed with residents, officers, and leaders who were eager to share ideas and keep the dialogue going. Michael was pleased to see familiar faces. Sergeant Smith, Officer Ramirez, and even Chief Reynolds had come to participate. The tone of the meeting was one of optimism, but also urgency. There was a shared understanding that while progress had been made, they were still at the beginning of a long road. Mrs. Turner opened the meeting, her voice strong and steady. "We've seen progress, yes, but we all know there's more work to be done. Tonight, we're going to focus on concrete steps. How do we ensure that this change we've started is sustained, that it becomes part of the fabric of our community?" Michael listened intently as people shared their thoughts. Some talked about creating more opportunities for officers to engage with residents outside of crisis situations, building trust before it was needed. Others emphasized the importance of continuing the training programs and holding officers accountable for their actions. The conversation was lively, and for the first time there was a sense of collaboration rather than division. When it was his turn to speak, Michael stood and addressed the group. "We've made strides, and I'm proud of what we've accomplished together. But this is a marathon, not a sprint. Sustained change requires ongoing effort. We need to continue having these conversations, continue holding each other accountable, and make sure that the policies and procedures we're implementing are actually followed. It's not enough to make promises. We need to see the results in our day-to-day interactions." He paused, looking around at the attentive faces. "This isn't just about preventing future incidents like mine. It's about building a community where every person feels safe and valued. That means working together, not just in times of crisis, but in times of peace." Sergeant Smith followed up with an update from the department, outlining their commitment to transparency and continued training. "We're working to ensure that every officer understands the importance of community partnership," she said. "We've instituted a review board made up of both officers and community members to address complaints and concerns. It's one of many steps we're taking to rebuild trust." The room buzzed with approval. The discussion continued late into the evening, with people sharing stories of how the atmosphere in the neighborhood had already begun to change, neighbors greeting each other more warmly, officers making an effort to be more approachable, and a growing sense of unity. As the meeting wound down, Michael found himself surrounded once again by neighbors and officers alike. Many came to shake his hand and thank him for his leadership, while others asked for advice on how to continue making a difference. Sergeant Smith approached Michael as the crowd thinned out. "You were right, General. These conversations are making a real difference," she said, her expression one of quiet determination. "But we both know there's still a lot of work ahead." Michael nodded, offering a smile. "There always is, but it's a good start. What matters is that we keep moving forward one step at a time." Smith extended her hand, and they shook firmly. "Together," she said. As Michael walked home that evening, the cool air filling his lungs, he reflected on how far they had come. The progress had been hard-won, but it was real. And while the road ahead was still long, he no longer felt like he was walking it alone. The community was with him. The police were with him. And most importantly, they were all walking together toward a future that promised justice, respect, and equality for everyone. For the first time in a long while, Michael felt at peace with the journey ahead. Sergeant Smith smiled, a look of satisfaction crossing her face as she leaned back in her chair. "That's exactly what we're aiming for, General. It's about more than just policies and procedures. It's about fostering a real connection between the officers and the people they serve. We can't expect trust if we're not actively working to build it." Michael nodded, reflecting on how much things had changed in such a short time. "I've seen the shift myself. People are more open, and there's less tension on the streets. But I know this isn't the end of the road. Reforms need to be constant, and the commitment has to be ongoing." "Absolutely," Smith agreed. We're taking this one step at a time. In addition to the training, we've also started conducting regular evaluations of officers' interactions with the public. We're holding ourselves accountable to higher standards, and I've made it clear that bias, in any form, won't be tolerated. Michael appreciated her resolve. Accountability is key. Without it, the policies don't mean much. It's about what happens on the ground every day. Smith nodded. That's why we're pushing for officers to get more involved in the community outside of just responding to calls. We're encouraging them to attend neighborhood events, to walk the streets and engage with people in a non-confrontational way. We want to be seen as part of the community, not just as enforcers of the law. The conversation continued, delving into more specifics about the new programs and initiatives the department was rolling out. Michael was particularly interested in the community police partnership committees that Smith had mentioned. These committees, made up of officers and community leaders, would serve as a platform for discussing concerns and working together on solutions. It's a way to keep the dialogue open and honest, Smith explained. We want people to feel like they have a direct line to the department, that their concerns will be heard and addressed. It's about transparency, but also about collaboration. Michael liked the idea. That kind of partnership is essential. It breaks down the us versus them mentality and helps both sides understand each other better. As their meeting wrapped up, Smith stood and extended her hand once more. General Adams, I want to thank you. Your involvement has made a real difference, and we're committed to making sure this progress continues. Michael shook her hand firmly. Thank you, Sergeant. I'm glad to be a part of this. It's a long road, but I believe we're moving in the right direction. As Michael left the station, he reflected on the conversation. The changes being made were significant, but they were just the beginning. There would always be challenges, moments of resistance, and setbacks along the way. But what mattered was the commitment to fairness, to justice, and to a community where everyone was treated with respect. As he stepped outside, the sun was beginning to set, casting a golden glow over the city. Michael felt a renewed sense of purpose. The path ahead was still long, but with people like Sergeant Smith leading the charge and a community willing to engage, he knew they were on the right track. If you're still tuned into this video and find the story inspiring, drop a 5 in the comments to let me know you're still with me. And for the first time in a while, he felt a deep sense of hope, not just for himself, but for the future of the community he called home. As Michael walked out of the station, the cool air hit him, carrying with it a sense of resolution. The journey that began with frustration and injustice had turned into something meaningful, something that carried the promise of real, lasting change. He felt proud, not just of himself, but of the community and the police force, people like Sergeant Smith, who had risen to the challenge with humility and determination. The sun was setting, casting a warm glow over the city. As Michael continued his walk, he thought about the road ahead. He knew that while progress had been made, the fight for justice and equality was never truly over. It demanded vigilance, persistence, and the willingness to keep pushing forward, even when things felt settled. Culture, as he had told Smith, wasn't something that changed overnight. It was built, little by little, through consistent actions, conversations, and choices. Michael's thoughts turned to the community. He had seen firsthand how people could come together when they felt empowered and heard. Neighbors who once kept to themselves were now talking, sharing, and connecting in ways they hadn't before. The ripple effects of that connection were already visible. A safer, more cohesive neighborhood where people looked out for one another. He passed by a group of kids playing basketball on a nearby court, their laughter filling the air. One of them waved at him, and Michael waved back, feeling a sense of belonging that hadn't always been there. The changes, both in the police department and in the community, were real. But Michael knew that for these changes to last, everyone had to stay engaged. Complacency wasn't an option. Later that evening, Michael returned home and sat on his porch, reflecting on the events that had unfolded over the past few weeks. His thoughts drifted back to the words he had exchanged with Sergeant Smith about culture, about the ongoing work that still needed to be done. He knew that there would be setbacks, that not everyone would embrace change as easily. But he also knew that they had laid a strong foundation, and with the right effort, that foundation could support something lasting. He picked up his phone and sent a message to Mrs. Turner, the community leader who had played such a vital role in organizing the forums. He thanked her for her support and suggested they plan another meeting soon to keep the conversation going. There was a sense of urgency in his message, a quiet resolve that they couldn't let the momentum slip away. As the stars began to emerge in the night sky, Michael felt hopeful. The fight for justice and equality was ongoing, but he knew that with the right people beside him, they could continue to make strides. They had started something that mattered, something that had the potential to create a brighter future for everyone in the community. And with that, Michael leaned back in his chair, ready to face whatever came next, knowing that the road to change was long, but never impossible. As we reflect on the journey of General Michael Adams and the transformative changes that followed, it's clear that progress comes from both courage and collaboration. The road to justice and equality requires constant effort, and we've seen how one incident can ignite meaningful dialogue and lasting reform. Now, it's time to turn the spotlight on you. What have you learned so far? What part of this story resonated with you the most? We encourage you to take a moment to reflect on how this conversation applies to your own life. Comment below with one thing you've learned and how you plan to bring it into practice. Your voice matters, and your commitment to change can make a real difference. If you liked this video, please leave your comment below, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel for more content like this. Together, we can keep the conversation going and continue working toward a better, more just world for everyone.